Welcome to the NASIG 2020 session, Communication and Context, Strategies for Onboarding New E-Resources Librarians, presented by Bonnie Thornton, Electronic and Continuing Resources Librarian at Mississippi State University. Please refer to SCED for a complete biography for Bonnie. Please also participate in our online forum, which can be located at the NASIG website with questions or comments about this session. These links are provided below this video. NASIG's Code of Conduct applies to all discussion on the forum. Please tweet about this session using the hashtag NASIG 2020. We would like to thank the NASIG sponsors for helping us make our online conference freely available. Okay, well, Bonnie, I now turn it over to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Steve. One moment here while I get my screen shared. Alrighty. All right. Thank you everyone for taking the time to listen to me share my presentation, Communications and Context, Strategies for Onboarding New E-Resources Librarians. Throughout this presentation, you are going to hear me use the terms e-resources librarians, electronic resources librarians, and ERLs interchangeably. This is all referencing the job title, although we are all well aware that depending upon the institution, the title, and the duties that fall under the domain of that title can vary quite a bit. The purpose of this presentation is to hopefully provide you some insight as to the importance that communication plays in the role of electronic resources librarians, and that is integral to maintaining the electronic resources lifecycle of your materials. It is such an integral part that it is both listed, both parts, the electronic resources lifecycle and communication, are listed within NASIG's core competencies. So this presentation will seek to contextualize both of those in a more integrated approach, and I'll hopefully be able to provide you some insight as to methods you may want to adapt when onboarding a new e-resources librarian or your onboarding procedures, so you may go ahead and reflect on the lens that communication plays in the roles of your institution. Next, there we go. So before we dive into this presentation, I'm just going to go ahead and give you a brief overview. I'll provide a bit more of a detailed introduction about myself so you understand where I'm coming from, as I am an early career librarian. As mentioned prior, I will be discussing the experiences of new e-resource librarians within context of NASIG's core competencies. Specifically, I'll be focusing on the core competency of effective communication, as well as that of the electronic resources lifecycle. And so I'll go ahead in the next couple of slides and review those, so you'll have a bit more of a baseline understanding when I'm going through that discussion. I'll follow that with a few questions and examples an institution may consider for onboarding a new librarian, and how to integrate that librarian into their external and internal pre-existing relationships, so that the fluidity of those relationships are maintained when a librarian steps into that new position. And then we'll go ahead and follow up with a brief conclusion. And then Steve will be so kind as to also end this presentation with a bit more resources for you as you enjoy this NASIG presentation, well, conference of 2020. So a bit more about me. As mentioned prior, but in case you need to hear it again, my name is Bonnie, and I graduated in May of 2018 at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign with my MS-LIS. I was a graduate assistant there for a couple of years for the history, philosophy, and newspaper library. In that role, I worked largely in a reference and instruction capacity, as well as assisting with circulation. Additionally, I worked at their high density storage facility as a copy cataloger, which is where I first experienced my first technical services role beyond that of classroom work and beyond that of archival work that I had done in my undergraduate course. Upon graduation, I was able to continue working in both of those capacities as extra help, and also managed to attain a role and worked as a temporary evening supervisor at the undergraduate library. But the idea of full-time employment was really appealing to me. So I was applying around, and in December of 2018, I was hired at Mississippi State University as a continuing resources librarian. That term effectively refers to a serials librarian position. So you may hear me say I was a serials librarian, excuse me. But that effectively is the role that I was hired into, was to learn how to maintain and perpetuate the life cycle of our print resources, and as well as update and maintain holdings for the print serials collections of Mississippi State University. I really had zero experience with any of that before I was hired in. So as soon as I started, it was a matter of stepping back and listening to other people, learning, and beginning to grow. About 6 months later, a position opened up at Mississippi State University because there was the creation of a new role, the Scholarly Communications Librarian, and Marianne Jones, who's very active in this organization, moved into that role. Because she moved into the role of the Scholarcom Librarian, the Electronic Resources Librarian position opened up, and I was transferred into that role. In that role, I have since then learned and grown and have taken on the duties of a full-time electronic resources librarian while also maintaining my role as the continuing resources librarian, thus my excessively long moniker, electronic and continuing resources librarian. And those new responsibilities, I am just 1 month shy of that work anniversary. In July of 2019 is when I started. So July of 2020, I'll have been in that role for a full year. So with that understanding, this year has been a lot of learning, growing, making mistakes, learning from those mistakes, doing some good things, feeling good about those good things, and really just growing as a professional. A bit more about the institution I work. Mississippi State University is an R1 land-grant institution with an FTE of approximately 22,000 students. So it is quite large, and that has both its advantages and disadvantages, as we'll discuss later on in this presentation. And there is an operating collections budget of approximately $9.8 million. It's more for the library if you include expenditures, but as far as collection purposes, we'll stick with 9.8. And about half of that, 4.6 million, is dedicated to electronic resources. So the idea of stepping into a role and managing that many millions of dollars of resources when you have minimal experience with budgeting beyond personal finance is a bit daunting. So let's go in then a bit to training. The training was really one of the better parts of my experience, and I had the good fortune that I moved into a position that was not vacated. It was a planned transition, and this makes a big difference in your institution because it leaves a bit more flexibility if your institution does not have really solidified or updated onboarding documentation in place. And I will emphasize this again throughout the presentation. I recommend you start looking into doing that now, because unless your transitions are planned for and someone at that institution is there to assist training that person, you will have a disruption of service if that position, say, opens immediately because somebody was struck by lightning. Ideally, that would not happen, but there's always a statistical chance. So I was fortunate that it was a planned transition. So Marianne took the time, and as well as Pat Mathis, my supervisor, to set up a training schedule for me. So I would feel more prepared and grounded stepping into that role. Additionally, my role in training did not end at the July 1 date, although I stepped into that role at that time officially. There are still personnel there that I could reference if I had questions, if there was a major error that occurred, which did happen on my very first day. There was a reset to default in some of our holdings, and it took quite a bit of time to go back and set all of those. However, I was able to identify what was happening, partially, well, A, it was reported, but B, I was able to reference the experienced staff on hand. And throughout those experiences and that training, that mentoring made me realize that I was stepping into many pre-existing relationships, and those relationships would then be mine to continue fostering and to manage in order to facilitate the operations of the library and our electronic resources. Additionally, I was continuing to learn and manage the institutional relationships that I had begun building when I was hired back in December. And this had to do with other members of the library. We have a larger faculty librarian. We have, I think, about 30 faculty librarians in addition to staff, as well as other committees campus-wide that work with the library. The benefit to working for a larger institution is I'm not the sole contact for initiating and maintaining all of those relationships right away. So it was then a matter of learning who in the library I would need to communicate with if I had collection management questions for, say, a specific department, and that was part of growing into my liaison team. And this, again, just really emphasized the key to relationships and maintaining the fluidity of those relationships for a new librarian is knowing who to talk to, when to talk to them. So I've been said more than once now, and forgive me for the repetitive buzzwords, but I've been mentioning talking and communication this whole time for this relationship building. So let's go ahead and review now then the professional frameworks of electronic resources librarians within NASIG that really emphasize this. And that would be the core competencies for electronic resources librarians. This is on the NASIG website. I have it hyperlinked here. If you Google it, it'll come right up. I was first exposed to the core competencies in my graduate coursework, which was a really nice baseline when I was beginning to even consider becoming an electronic resource librarian as a possibility of a career. And you'll note that effective communication, core competency 4, which I have listed here, is important enough that it merits its own competency. That those in charge of developing the competencies for our professional guidelines realize that the skill set of communication is important enough to highlight throughout for a professional to consider. And this is important to stress because even though electronic resource librarians work within collection management capacities a lot of the times, we are largely intermediaries. We are troubleshooting when things come to us. We may not have the skills to troubleshoot the issue, but we need to know who to talk to fix and resolve issues. As far as licensing, we may be intermediaries in getting signatures for the licensing, setting things up. So I'm going to go ahead and just give you a few seconds, or a minute if you need it. You can always hit pause since this is a recording to review this core competency 4, and then I'll go ahead and discuss it a bit further. All right, so now that we've taken some time to review, you'll note that there are some highlighted sections. Those are my own highlights, highlighted for emphasis, the internal and external stakeholders that ERLs work with. And I will dive into this a bit more later in our presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it for now. And we're going to go on then and review the next competency that's important for an electronic resource librarian to be familiar with, and that is the electronic resources lifecycle itself, competency 1. Now, I've not listed out the bullet points and descriptors. That, again, is listed on NASIG's website. I would recommend it, but I have listed a graphic that is very common in ERL literature. And that is a really good starting point to understand electronic resources as the object, as the subject. It is that piece of information or the pieces of information in the collection that we are managing. Oliver Pesch created this graphic. He's a EBSCO representative in about 2008, although this comes from a 2009 presentation. And you'll notice that there are 5 main action verbs pertaining to perpetuating the life cycle of that object, of that digital source. And that is to acquire, provide access, administer, provide support, evaluate, and monitor. So these these action verbs are perpetuated by a person, by your personnel, by yourself as the librarian. And so that's why this graphic really may be better understood within context of competency for effective communication. The new e-resources librarian stepping into that role needs to realize that these action verbs, this perpetuation of the cycle, does not happen independently of a vacuum. Regardless of the point of the cycle, you will at some point in time need to communicate in order to continue to perpetuate this cycle. As you review, this is just a brief aside, again, depending on what your organization is, the type of organization and its size, you'll notice that there are quite a few boxes that list the different components that go into perpetuating the cycle. Not all of these may be applicable to you if you don't use Easy Proxy or you use, say, Open Athens instead. So keep in mind, not all things may apply to you, and that's okay. And there may be things that apply to you that you think would fit in this graph elsewhere. That is also okay. It is a fluid graphic. But in better order to understand this graphic within context of a new librarian, it's best understood in the way I've depicted here, arguably. And you'll see that it really is more of an eye. In this graphic here, you'll note that there are notes about the components and all the personnel you'll need to communicate with, or the new librarian will need to communicate with, in perpetuating the electronic resources lifecycle. So I'm going to go ahead and read through some of these. If you get too bored, go ahead, fast forward 30 seconds. I won't be offended, but I will be referencing it again later on. But as for now, I'm going to go ahead and just begin in the upper right-hand corner. So you'll notice that part of the acquisitions, there will be open communications with vendors, legal and procurement and contracts personnel, because a lot of e-resources do require a legal signature, and others responsible for acquisitions decisions. So for example, at Mississippi State, I work closely with acquisitions librarian Kathy Dunn, and she's responsible for all of our ebooks and streaming videos purchasing orders. I am not, but we do still work closely together for those acquisitions decisions. So for providing access, of course, you'll have to communicate with the vendor or the account manager, as well as your tech team or catalogers and electronic resource personnel, to make sure bibliographic records and proper links and holdings are set up for those resources, so your patrons will be able to have access. As far as administrating those resources, the resources are administered by consistently and efficiently communicating really as just part of the day job with library personnel, systems personnel, and vendor specialists. And then if providing support also is part of that. So you'll be establishing troubleshoot contact information and workflow processes. And this is a very dynamic process. So the troubleshooting process is very dynamic. So some things I've learned I can troubleshoot. Others then may need to be escalated to systems personnel, to campus IT, to the vendor. And so really it's just a matter of knowing who to talk to and when. And we'll dive into that a bit more later. Note that depending on the size of your institution may determine the number of library units or personnel involved in resolving an issue or providing support of access to a resource. That goes hand in hand with evaluating and monitoring. Patrons may be the first to note an issue and let you know about it, and that will open a channel of communication with the librarian. It may not be you, it may be a reference librarian, it may be someone on the phone and access services. You really don't know, but from there on, they may be the first to open up that channel. Likewise, that channel of communication or those error reports may come from vendor emails, and you may notice things on but professional listservs. So it may be something completely external yet relevant to your organization that you'll need to keep an eye on. And a further part of acquiring materials, you'll be cooperating with vendors, you'll be cooperating with your own administration. I beg of you, please cooperate with your own administration, and you'll be cooperating with librarians responsible for administering the trial. If you encounter that your library has a restricted budget, which many of us do now, especially in light of the pandemic, and you are unable to purchase new items, and you know that you're going to not be able to purchase new items potentially for a couple of years, you should still go ahead and have those conversations with the vendor. Go ahead and set some time, because you never know what might open up in the future. And it really helps to maintain and initiate those positive relationships, simply because when money does come available, you might be able to work out more of a deal. Those vendors, they work with many different institutions, so they may have a better idea of the same problems other libraries are having, and therefore work to provide solutions in the acquisitions process. So you don't have to, be on the phone with your account manager every week, but just say, hey, let's check in a couple months, let's check in 5 months, see what's going on. And that really is beneficial to your patrons if you can eventually secure those resources. And if at the end of the day, you can't secure those resources because of lack of funds, the worst you did was have a positive conversation and learn about, some of the great products there are out there that others who do have funds might be able to acquire and share in the future. So I just spoke quite a bit about the context of all of those communications that happen when perpetuating those e-resources life cycles. And how does that pertain to your new e-resources librarian? Well, picture this, just think about your organization for a minute and think about everything that you are offering electronically. And then think about the number of publishers and the number of vendors you may be working with to offer those resources. Well, the librarian stepping into that role is going to be responsible for perpetuating the life cycle of all of those various resources dependent upon their start date. And that start date intersects with the point of the cycle that those e-resources are, as far as their renewals and licensing. And troubleshooting, of course, will happen any day of the week. You never know when problems are going to pop up. So it really helps that librarian when they're stepping into that role to gain context of the life cycle of your institution's resources by providing them the context that they'll need and helping them maintain and grow and build those relationships that they'll need to have in order to work with these resources to help provide access and maintain access with your institution. And that leads to a further discussion then of who are they going to talk to? Who do they need to know? Effectively, who are your stakeholders? I'm going to take a moment here for a sip of water, and then I'll dive right into this section. So, your stakeholders, internal and external. Internal stakeholders are going to be your fellow librarians. They're going to be your fellow staff. They may be systems. Mississippi State University is fortunate enough to have their own systems unit that's right around the corner from where I work when I'm not working remotely. And we have a campus IT. They are internal. Administration, library administration's internal. If you have a board of regents or another board, although they are beyond the walls and operate beyond the walls of the library, they affect internal policy and expenditures. So those are still counted, at least through my framework, or the framework I'm presenting here, as internal stakeholders. And so those external stakeholders are going to be vendors, vendor representatives, account managers, sales, customer service. The more direct the contact, the better. They will be authentication and tech support for those authentication measures. For example, Mississippi State does not use Easy Proxy. We use Open Athens. And so we communicate with the Open Athens team when we're setting up new resources or have overarching issues. But we also have a tech support team with EBSCO, who's an intermediary and is our first line for assisting with Open Athens issues as well. And patrons, although patrons can come from anywhere, they're external. They will point out many things within your resources that they either would like to request, or if there is an issue. Brief aside, if a patron points out an issue, pay particular attention, because you don't know how many times it went unreported before it was reported that once. So we've identified those stakeholders, and you can maybe think of who they are. But if a new librarian comes in and they've done the basic research of your organization on the website, and they've done some meet and greets, but just on their first day, and they're sitting down at their desk, how and where are those stakeholders identified for that librarian? And so this goes hand in hand with the idea of documenting everything for your institution. So how might that institutional knowledge, including administrative functions and vendor contacts, best be documented for a new e-resources librarian? And the location and effectiveness of this documentation helps determine how effectively a new e-resources librarian may identify who to talk to and when. It doesn't matter how much experience this librarian has, it's not going to be easy for them if they come into an organization and everyone's just doing their own thing. So it would behoove you to review then, or maybe reflect. We have all those contacts, you have those relationships, but identify who's maintaining what relationships. Who's the person that's talking with your board? Is there input from other faculty or staff that an administrator might need when communicating with the board? Who on your staff or personnel is responsible for interacting as the first point of contact with patrons? Who is maintaining those vendor relationships for renewals? And of course, for me, that is my position, but in other places it might be a staff person, and you just really want to have that documented in case something happens to that person. Mississippi State utilizes shared drives for documentation. We're now shifting towards OneDrive, but it's still in between, and we still lean heavily on the shared drives. But other examples of documentation and knowledge-based sharing software may be SharePoint, a wiki, Google Drive, OneDrive, etc., or even just a procedures binder with a Word document. If that's what works for your library, then by all means go ahead and use it. I cannot stress enough, though, make sure everyone is referencing the same area, the same file, the same folder. So if you have librarians who have been working at an institution for years, and then you have new librarians, if in a meeting somebody says, I'm referencing document A in folder B on this drive, make sure that everybody knows that's the one that needs to be referenced, so that a new person, digging through those shared folders isn't referencing, say, document X on a completely separate folder, although maybe the same drive. And this really just has to do with the fact that things get squirreled away, and that's why always appreciate your friends in the archives. They'll help you sort that out. But things get squirreled away, so identify where all of those are, identify clearly and precisely, and make sure that information isn't siloed. So especially with larger institutions, this is not uncommon, but there may be multiple branch libraries, and there may be multiple floors. So even though all librarians may know each other, they may be storing and referencing documentation from different areas. And so it's really good to try to deconstruct and de-silo that information So that way, you know who's in charge of editing what documents. If everyone can edit a document, if it's shared in a specific area, say a reference person wants to edit something in collection management services, for example, by going to the collection management services drive, that may tip them off, oh, I should contact CMS to let them know I'm making this edit, and then discuss that edit XYZ. So if your institution does not have that set up, go ahead and maybe make that a task for your new librarian to help provide and start developing that documentation. And this in and of itself, particularly for e-resources librarians with the life cycle, because vendors are so helpful and involved with this aspect. How do you transition the new ERL to understand and maintain the fluidity of vendor contact relationships? So if possible, so if it is a planned disruption of employment, so you know the new librarian is coming into position, plans, set up an automatic email to notify vendors of that new e-resources librarian and their contact information. And just make this an automatic part of your onboarding procedure so it's not accidentally overlooked. Vendors will be able to contact people, institutions, and get a hold of them for renewal and invoicing in multiple capacities, but to maintain the fluidity of the relationships and the cycle of resources, it's better to go ahead and try to maintain as constant as possible. So if it's the ERL who's in charge of perpetuating this relationship, make sure you continue it with the new ERL to be the person perpetuating that relationship. And then if a former librarian has planned to leave, and just go ahead and ask as part of their offboarding process or their exit process if they have vendor contact cards, even if they're dated, or any documentation they might leave for the new librarian. Ideally, this vendor contact information will be part of the shared procedure documentation. So for example, at Mississippi State, we have contract contact information listed side by side with our contract renewals licensing documentation. And so that's extraordinarily helpful. So anyone who would step into my role if I was gone would be able to say, oh, I need to contact Cindy at, you know, Globetrotters Anonymous for whatever magazine that might be for that renewal. Or they could go ahead and send that email for, well, not for me, but for that organization. Because again, although every person is unique, we are working as a greater part of a whole, which is the library to serve our patrons. Troubleshooting. Excuse me, one moment. So troubleshooting will be an almost immediate part of the new librarian's job as these issues pop up at any given time. So have an updated organization chart readily available for reference. And have clear documentation of troubleshooting workflows. If you do not have this documentation, start creating this documentation. Or again, maybe write it into the instructions for your new librarian if they want a project for them to start writing this documentation. Ideally, it'd be edited by anyone who encounters these errors. So what one eye doesn't catch, the other may. Again, I've been fortunate to step into a position where if an issue arises that hasn't popped up and only pops up once every 4 years, which has happened, there are personnel in the library who I can talk with who have seen this issue before to help resolve the issue. And that documentation assists with other issues and knowing who to talk to. So for example, at Mississippi State University, due to the nature of our size, I do not communicate with campus IT directly. Now, this has nothing to do with me not knowing or not liking the people who work in IT. I'm fairly good friends with somebody over there, but because of the size of our institution, I am not the designated contact person to escalate things beyond the walls of the library. So what I do instead, if it's something that does merit campus IT, I will talk to our designated contact person in the library systems, and they will go ahead and communicate for me to IT or communicate that problem and include me on that ticket. If the person in systems is gone, our next designated point of contact is the assistant dean. and then they would take place. If both of those people, for whatever reason, were out, then I might take it upon myself to go ahead and reach out, but we have fairly clear organization in that of the steps of who can talk to who outside of which walls. And then these clear indicators of who to contact help prevent accidental oversteps and communicating with the incorrect person to resolve an issue. Of course, although I'm saying document everything, and it is important to document everything and communicate those documentations, of course, people are going to make mistakes. I've made mistakes. I accidentally escalated an issue which could have been resolved fairly easily, but I learned that after the fact by trial and error. I ate some humble pie. I haven't made that mistake since, and it was a good learning experience. People weren't offended. It just did add a bit of time to resolving what was a fairly straightforward issue within the career of this new e-resources librarian. But having that documentation can help perhaps prevent that. So additional questions you may want to ask is if someone isn't available to train the new librarian or to assist them with acclimating to the role, what steps are in place for the librarian to adapt to the proper internal and external channels of communication within their institution? How is this librarian stepping in and going to maintain the fluidity and build and foster those relationships? Of course, you can't do everything for the new librarian, but even just letting them know who those contacts are, you're going to help your organization succeed because you're working with your colleague. How does your institution then foster departmental relationships in a way that's sustainable? Again, I work for a library that has about 30 faculty librarians, and they're fairly tight-knit, and it's great to get to know them, but we do work on different floors. So what steps beyond just a basic day meeting or committee work here and there do you have to build those relationships? Because it's really important to not silo within your organization so that they feel comfortable talking to you and you can help everyone succeed in accessing your electronic resources no matter which part of the life cycle, and be ready and responsive to answering questions. And that partly is because you've taken the time to build those relationships beyond the walls of your technical services area. So that effectively concludes my presentation. I hope you found some of this meandering a bit helpful. Really, when reviewing those core competencies and whenever discussing or thinking about your e-resources in the life cycle of those e-resources, I just encourage you to think about those in terms of how they're related to the people managing them. And if it's a new person particularly, just take some time to reflect. And maybe it's been a while since your institution's hired, or maybe you're not hiring. But if anyone came in and looked at your documentation, how might that change the dynamic of those relationships? How might you help people adapt to the dynamic of those relationships? And subsequently, when building those positive relationships, how might that help you positively impact the accessibility and the management of your institution's e-resources? A lot of my thought process has been influenced by the readings that I've listed here. The guidelines for ALCTS is an excellent supplement that emphasizes further stakeholders in the world of collection management services, although not e-resources specific. I do recommend you take a moment to review it. It's an excellent supplement to the work that we do. Additionally, we are happy to be here, the onboarding experience in academic libraries. If you are just now looking into developing an onboarding procedure for new librarians at your institution, they have some excellent questions, and that article provides some excellent insight for those librarians. And again, I would highly recommend it. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me talk. If you made it all the way through this presentation, more power to you. I do appreciate it. I will be responsive to the forum. If you don't want to contact me on the forum, by all means, go ahead and just send me an email at bthornton@library.msstate.edu, or go ahead and give me a call. If I'm not available at phone, leave a message and I will get back with you as soon as possible. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me today or this evening or whenever you hit play on this recording, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bonnie. And thank you for attending this NASIG 2020 session. Bonnie will be monitoring the NASIG forum through June 2020, so you can post questions there. The links to the forum, SCED, and our code of conduct are below the video. Please tweet about this session using the hashtag NASIG 2020. Thank you.